Okay, so now let's take a look at the multidimensional array, section 3.4. Okay, the multidimensional array. Okay, so basically the multidimensional array, it's you can think as like, for example, right? You can think if you, okay, it could be theoretically you can have a three-dimensional, fourth dimension, and the four-dimensional, and the five-dimensional, etc. Right? But in this class, we are going to only talk about the three-dimensional arrays. Usually, it's not common, right, to use the four-dimensional array. So we're gonna learn up to three-dimensional array. Basically, you can think what the first dimensional array is basically a vector, right? And the second dimensional array you can think as what is a matrix, right? And then we're gonna basically learn about the three-dimensional array. As mentioned in the class, so basically the vectors and matrix can be considered as a special case of the more general array, right? Just like I said, the vector is what? The vector is a one-dimensional array, and matrix you can think as a two-dimensional array, right? And now we're going to learn basically a three-dimensional array. Okay, so you can think this is like a three-dimensional array, right? So for the three-dimensional array, basically what? I know it looks complex, but it's not that, it's complicated. So basically, they're using the square bracket, as you can see, right? And then the first one is going to be row, comma, column, comma, layer. Okay? So, as you can see, right? This is, for example, 3 times 4 times 2 basically three-dimensional array, but dimension is a 3 times 4 times 2. Okay, so this is what? This first one is row, right? And then second number is what? Column, C, right? And then last number is a layer. Okay, so if you look at this diagram, conceptual diagram of 3 times 4 times 2 array, right? An index of each element is given at the corresponding position. Okay, so now, the last one is a layer, right? So how many layers? Basically, in this diagram is a 2 layers, right? I'll show you so the first one is a 2 layer, right? So this, right? This is the first layer, right? So if you look at the element of the first layer, right? Basically, these are the element of the first layer, right? Right. So this is the elements of the first layer. And then now the next one, the second layer, right? So I'm going to use the blue. Basically, this is the second layer. Right? So this is the second layer, and the elements of the second layer is this, right? So this is the elements of the second layer. So you can think this is a building, right? Building with what? 2 floors. The red one is the first floor, and then the blue one, you can think as like a second floor. So this is a building with what? 2 floors, right? And then the first one is a row, right? So I'm going to use so if you look at the first layer, the red layer, and the first index is a row, right? So this is the first row, right? And this is the second row, and then this is a third row. So this is a row, right? And then now let's look at the second one is what? Column, right? So this is a column. So if you go this way, this is column, right? So this is the first column, and this is a second column, right? And then third column and fourth column, right? And what? This is the second row, right? First column, second column, third column, and the fourth column of the first floor, right? Layer 1. And this is what? This is the row number 3, first column, second column, third column, and fourth column of what? The first floor, right? Layer 1, and etc., right? The blue one actually you can apply the same concept. Okay, so basically this is what? This is a 3 times 4 times 2 array. Okay, now let's just do some experiment. Okay, so basically let's just try to create a 3-dimensional array, right? Okay, so let's just create a 3-dimensional array. Okay, so this is like 3 by so you're gonna use the function array, and then for the argument, the dimension is 3 times 4 times 2 array, right? And the data set is gonna be one vector, right? 1 through 24. This makes sense, right? Because what? How many elements in 3 by 4 by 2 array? 3 times 4 times and then 2, right? Is what? It's 24, right? So we should have 24 elements in this 3-dimensional array if the dimension is like this, right? If the dimension is 3 times 4 times 2, you will end up having what? 24 elements. And that's why the vector is 1 through 2. And without any options, typically what is a column-wise, the array will be created in a what? The column-wise fashion, right? So you know that this is what? This is a 3 by 4, right? So remember, this is a row, the column, and this is layer, right? So this is the first layer, and then row is a 3, and then column is 4, right? So this is like a first building, right? And then this is what? Created in a column-wise fashion, right? You see that? This is column-wise fashion, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 2, right? So this is like first floor, first layer. And then if you look at the next, let me just, if you look at the next layer, which is a layer number 2, right? The 3 times 4 times 2, then this is the, basically this is the second layer, right? So let's just try, okay? Let's just try this. So let's say AR, right? And then we're going to use array function, right? Array. And data is 1 through 24, right? And then the dimension is what? Dimension is, we're going to use a vector for the dimension, right? 3 by 4 times 2, right? So that's like a 3 times 4 times 2. That's the dimension of this array, right? And let's run. And then let's print AR, right? And then run. Okay, so you know that, see? As you can see, this is what? This is the first floor, right? Layer 1. And this is layer 2. And each layer, right? You have 3 times what? 4. And then second layer 3 times 4, right? And then this array is filled in a column-wise fashion. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Right? The first floor is done, right? Now go to the second floor, 13, 14, 15, and etc. Right? So we can create a 3 by 4 times 2 array, right? Okay. So now let's just move to next example. Okay, now, by the way, we're not going to talk about anything greater than 3-dimensional array. So this is like a 4-dimensional array, right? So we're not going to talk about this in this class. Okay, and then same concept can be applied to an array, right? When it comes to subsetting, okay, extraction and replacement. So now let's take a look at this example. This example said we have AR, right? So you know that this is AR, right? And then try to want to second row of the second layer. Okay, so that means what? second row of the second layer. That's if that's something that you want to extract. So let's just use this pencil. So this second row, oops. Second row, right? Actually second layer, right? Second layer. So this is a second layer of the second row. So basically, if you want to extract this guy, right? So then basically you can do is what? This is a first of all, you define the second what? The second floor, right? Second layer. And this means what? Let's use the red. Okay, so this is 2, right? This is the second layer. I mean the second row, right? So this guy. And then since this is a blank, right? Blank means what? If you look at the column, there's a blank, right? So blank means everything. Like every column. Because the column field is a blank, means basically it's every column, all the columns. Okay, so now let's just do experiment. So AR, right? 2, and then blank, right? And then second layer, right? So let's just run this. And as you can see, you see that this is a result, right? 14, 17, 23. Right? Okay. So basically, if you want the specific elements from this vector, say the third and the first in that order, you can call the following. Okay, so now what that means is this third and the first in that order, right? Let's see. Okay, so now if you look at the still, right? Second layer, right? And then the second row, so which is this guy. However, if you look at the column, they say third column and the first column in that order. So the third column, 20, and then first column, right, which is 14. So this is column, right? Third column and first column. So 20 and 14, right? So let's see. AR 2, and then vector C, third column and first column, and then what? The second layer, right? So let's just run this. Okay, so 20 and 14, right? So that's something that we expect to get. Okay, so pretty much I'm done with the, we're not going to talk about four-dimensional array. Okay, so now let's take a look at the exercise problem. Okay, so now let's take a look at the problem A. The part A is create a store and the three-dimensional array with the 6 layers of a 4 times 2 matrix filled with a decreasing sequence of values between 4.8 and 0.1 of the appropriate length. Okay, so first we know that it's what? The first is 4-2 by matrix, and then so basically we need to build a building, right? And with the 6 floors, right? 6 layers. So first, and then 4 by each floor, right? Each layer, the dimension is a 4 by 2, right? So basically, this is a 4, right? And this is a 2. So this is 2. Okay, and this is like first floor, right? And then what? You need to build another floor, and like another floor, right? And another floor, right? And then etc. So you how many floors you have? You have a 6 floors, right? The 6 layers, and then so actually there are 2 more. And then the dimension for each floor is what? 4, right? And 4 by 2, right? Okay, so basically this is something you need to build. So we're gonna use the array, right? And then, but this is a little bit tricky, the 4.8 to 0.1, right? So we're gonna use the sequence rather than the vector C, right? So remember we learned the sequence, right? So from is 4.8 and then 2 is 0.1 and length is basically we have to specify how many elements, right? So since this is what? 4 by 2 by 6 matrix, 4 by 2 by 6 matrix. So if you just multiply this 6 times 8, 48, right? So basically the 48 elements, right? So the length out.a should be 48. Okay, the dimension is 4 by 2 by 6. Okay, so we're gonna use the first to build the and they said store, right? So we need to use a variable, create and store, right? So we'll just use what? Let's say it's problem A, so what variable? Let's say, you know, just any variable name, right? So I'll say, you know, I'll just use AR. I mean, since we, no, actually maybe something different. Maybe CR, okay, just anything, any variable name. Okay, so 6 layer, right? So let's say array, right? And then data, this time we're going to use a sequence instead of a vector C. So from, and you know, whenever we use a sequence we have a from and to, right? From is 4.8, right? And then 2 is 0.1, right? And then what? And then the length is 48. So LENGTH out, right? Is 48, right? So we have 48 elements, right? Right, we have 48 elements. 4 times 2 times 6, we have a 48, and that's why we have a 48 here. Okay, so basically they're going to evenly divide this, right? And there's to be 48 intervals, right? Starting from 4.8 to all the way down to 0.1, right? Okay. Now then what? So done with the data, right? And then we have to provide a dimension, right? Comma, and the dimension is, then we're gonna vector C, 4 by 2 by 6, right? Okay, let's just make it this. You know what? Okay. Okay, so the dimension is 4 by 2 by 6. Okay, so then with the array, so right, so I'm gonna execute this. Okay, and then let's just print CR. Let's run this. Okay, as you can see, okay, so this is like first floor, and then second floor, and then third floor, right? And then fourth and fifth and sixth. And for if you look at each floor, the dimension is 4 by what? A 2 matrix, right? For each floor, each layer, 4 by 2, and etc. So it's all the way to what? All the way to what? Layer 6, 5, and then 4, right? Okay, so you're done with the part A. Now let's look at the part B. The part B is extract and store the new object, the fourth and the first row elements in that order of the second column only of all layers of A. So from A, we're going to extract these things, right? But let's just look at this. They said of all layers, right? So that means the layer field, the layer index should be just empty because it's all layers, right? So remember, if you look at the index, the first one is row, column, the next one is a layer, right? L, layer. But they said all layers, so this has to be blank. And then object the fourth and then first row, right? So that means for the what? Let's see. Okay, so that means for the row, right? We need to use a vector of 4, 1, and they said what? Second column, right? So second column is just 2, right? Okay, so so the answer is, and then they say extract and store, right? So I'm gonna use dr this time. We need to store it, and then the cr, right? Which one? The one that we use, right? Because they said from A. Okay, the cr, and then the c, right? And then what? Fourth and then first row. The fourth and then first row, and then what? Second column, right? And then of all layers, so the what? The layer index should be empty, right? So pretty much that's it. So let's run, and then type dr and see what happens. Okay, so see, this is the this should be the answer, right? Okay, so you can see the result is what? The result is this matrix, right? Okay, as you can see, this is a matrix, right? It's 2 by 6 matrix, right? And you should be able to visualize this. Okay, so what I mean by is let's just go back. So there's, remember, okay, maybe this is where's that? Oh yeah, okay. So now let's take a look at this. I know that this is not what? This is not the 3 times 4 times 2 array, right? However, I mean, I'm just giving you the basic concept, okay? Although it's not this matrix, the CR, right? The CR matrix is not like this. I want you to, like, you know, you should be able to visualize this. Let me show you. The first, it says, if you look at this, that means the first and the fourth row, the fourth row and the first row, and then second column of all the layers, right? So the fourth row, right? So remember, this is the first row, and then second row, and then third row, and then there's a fourth row, right? Assuming there's a fourth row, right? The fourth row, right? And then what? So it's the second column, right? So this is the second column, right? This is the first column, this is second column. So they are really pointing at this number here, right? So I'll just use the blue. So they use the blue. Okay, so this number, right? And then what? There is what? How many layers? So there's 6 layers, right? So this is like a first layer, and then could be another layer, right? And then third layer, and then fourth layer, and then fifth layer, and then sixth layer, right? So how many of them? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. Now, let's look at the first row, right? So this is the first row, and then second column. So this is the second column, right? But how many layers? There are 6 layers, right? So this is the first one, and then this is the second one, and then third, fourth, and then fifth, and then sixth, right? So this is like another 6 elements, right? So this is this. So basically this is what the result is: 2 by 6 matrix, right? So you know that this is 2 by 6 matrix. So that's how you should be able to visualize this. Okay, so the result is 2 by 6 matrix. Okay, so I'm done with pretty much all the exercise problem, because I think the C and D and E, it's like they deals with what 4-dimensional array. So we're not going to talk about 4-dimensional array in this class, just up to 3. Okay, so 3-dimensional array. And the first dimensional array is basically a vector. The second dimensional array is basically a matrix. And then now we have just learned what 3-dimensional array, right? Okay, thank you. Bye.